Okay, I love talking about what we do. But now, what we're going to do for the rest of our time is look at the topic of human dignity through a biblical lens. And this is something that's really on our hearts at Care and is on God's heart, according to the Bible. So we're going to have 3 points: dignity given, dignity denied, and then dignity restored. So let's kind of dive right in. Dignity given. 1948, the UN Declaration of Human Rights was written. 10th of December that year, it was proclaimed at the UN General Assembly in Paris. And article number 1, it's the most important article, isn't it, by virtue of its position. And what does it say? It says, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. So everyone is equal in dignity, whoever you are. All human beings. And as Christians, we say yes, amen. But this Declaration of Human Rights didn't give dignity to anyone. It's not that before it was written, 1947, humans didn't have dignity, and then as of that day, suddenly we did. No, it describes what's already true, doesn't it? All human beings are equal in dignity and rights. So if not from this document, where does that dignity and equality come from? And that's actually quite a hard question to answer. Philosophers have debated it for generations and basically can't agree. But as Christians, we have an answer. And it's found, next slide, in the opening chapters of the book of Genesis. We look at what it means to be human. Genesis 2, verse 7, the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. So the first component that makes us what we are it's actually just dust, isn't it? He formed man from the dust. Genesis 3, later he says to Adam, you are dust, to dust you shall return. Psalm 103, don't go on yet, Austin, if you go back to the previous one. Psalm 103, he knows how we're formed. He remembers that we are dust. And so we're made from the same building blocks as the world around us. You share 50% of your DNA with a tree. 98% of your DNA with a chimpanzee. We're made from the same materials, but there's something different about humanity, isn't there? There's something more about humanity. We could chop down a tree, but we probably don't want to chop down a human in the same way. We're not just dust. And what's different about humans is we are made in the image of God. So God has done something different in the way he made us. So just a few verses earlier, now we'll go next slide. At the end of Genesis 1, God had made the whole world. He had seen that it was good. This is good, this is good, this is good. And in Genesis 1:27, we have like the pinnacle of God's creative work. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish and the sea and the birds in the sky, the livestock, all the wild animals, over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them. So we're made in the image of God, and this is where the dignity comes from. This gives every human a dignity, a value that cannot be taken away. Another way of thinking about it is this. Next slide. This is a picture of my wife, Sophie, an image of her. That picture is not Sophie. It's a picture of Sophie. It's not actually her. It represents her. So if you were to take that picture, if I had a physical copy, and if you were to take that and tear it in half and trample it on the ground, you wouldn't have actually hurt Sophie at one level because it's not her, but you would have kind of insulted her in some way because it's an image of her, that the picture represents her. It tells you something about her. It would help you to recognize her if she walked in the door. She's not about to. That's what an image does. And being made in the image of God means that we represent God. We tell the world around us something about what God is like. And being made in his image gives an inherent value and dignity that the world can't match. There's a highly influential philosopher called Peter Singer. Next slide. His thinking influences much of medical ethics today, but his worldview basically comes down to this. He says, your dignity depends on your function. What can you do? Can you choose? Can you exercise autonomy? And so he would say, if someone is in a permanent coma, their life is of less value than someone fit and physically active. He'd also say, if someone is deeply loved by those around them and has many kind of interconnecting relationships, their life is worth more than somebody who is a recluse and doesn't interact with others from 1 month to the next. And so, in his world, he creates a sort of a sliding scale where people's lives go up and down in value depending on their state. And indeed, he says this is true across species as well. So, a dog, if it's better at communication, self-awareness, loving connection, if it is better at that than maybe what he would call a severely defective infant child, then the dog is worth more in Peter Singer's world, in the modern world. But for Christians, we say it's different. Our dignity doesn't reside in what you can do. It's not about how capable you are. It's not how developed your brain is or how deteriorated your brain is, but in who you are, in what God has made you to be. So the moment God creates you, he says, this creature is made in my image. And in that moment, he assigns eternal significance and value to what would otherwise be dust. So next slide, Psalm 8 says of humans, says to God, you have made humans a little lower than the angels and crowned them with glory and honor. You've made them rulers over the works of your hands. You put everything under their feet. So God crowns us with glory and honor. We have this inherent dignity because of this fact that we are not just dust like everything else, but made in God's image. I love what G.K. Chesterton wrote. People are equal in the same way pennies are equal. Some are bright and others are dull. Some are worn smooth, others are sharp and fresh. But all are equal in value, for each penny bears the image of the sovereign, and each person bears the image of the King of Kings. So to be human is to have this dignity. We are dignified dust. But that's not the whole story on dignity. So our second point is dignity denied. We're not still living in the Garden of Eden. Something happened, didn't it? Something awful. Adam and Eve, they sinned, they rebelled against God. And if we go back to the idea of how we reflect God's image and glory, like a mirror reflecting him, in that moment, it's like they took a big hammer to the mirror and smashed it into 1,000 pieces. But praise God, terrible though that moment was, it didn't completely destroy our human dignity. Our dignity was not removed. Our dignity was not lost. We are still made in the image of God. The pieces of the mirror, the shards of God's image, they're still there. The image has been a bit defaced, a bit distorted, like one of those kind of carnival mirrors, but not destroyed. This is confirmed a few chapters later. Genesis 9 God institutes the punishment for murder. He says, whoever sheds blood, human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made mankind. So this is after Adam and Eve and all of that. It's saying the image of God is still there. And paradoxically, because human life is so precious, only capital punishment was sufficient retribution for the unauthorized taking of a human life. And even into the New Testament, the image of God still there. So James chapter 3, that famous chapter about the tongue, he writes, with the tongue we praise our Lord and Father, and with it we curse human beings who have been made in God's likeness, or God's image. So humanity still made in God's image. People sometimes talk about losing their dignity, don't they, or being stripped of their dignity. But if even Adam and Eve's rebellion in the garden didn't take away their dignity, it didn't remove the image of God from them, then nothing can. And we can deny our dignity, next slide, by the way we act and by the way we treat others. And we do that all the time. We deny our dignity, but that dignity isn't removed. It can't be. So we deny dignity in the way we act. That's what Adam and Eve did. They acted as if they were not made in the image of God, as if they were not representing him to the world around. And every time we sin, that's what we're doing. We're denying our God-given dignity. But also we deny dignity in others by the way we treat them. So a few examples. That's George Floyd, a picture of him on the screen. Racism, it's ascribing greater value to one group of image bearers over another. It's dividing image bearers, all equal, all made in the image of God. It's saying, we're going to treat you differently according to where you're from or how you look. But even the most horrendous acts of racism, the evils of the slave trade, they don't take away dignity, but they deny it by acting as if their victims were not made in the image of God. Next one, ethics around the beginning of human life are another area where human dignity is under attack. See, people act as if the unborn child has less value because he or she is still in the mother's womb, because he or she is kind of less developed in terms of brain function. Psalm 139 tells us, you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. And it's summed up by that phrase, I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Fearfully and wonderfully. So what value each and every life has from the moment of conception. Yet in our world, that value, that dignity is denied when we're told these unborn children are just a clump of cells or an embryo or a fetus, not to be assigned the same value as a human outside the womb. That's the beginning of life. And you have the same at the end of life. It comes to the question of assisted suicide. The argument is that if we would put an animal out of its suffering, then surely it's compassionate and good to do the same for a human who is suffering unbearably, who no longer wants to live. And the argument goes that that is more dignified than dying in pain and suffering and distress. Now, there are plenty of non-religious arguments as to why assisted suicide is a terrible idea for any society. But from a simple dignity perspective, as Christians, we say, well, humans, we're not just like animals. We're different because we're made in the image of God. We therefore have such high value that we should never treat our lives as if they're disposable and to be ended when we've had enough. We say as Christians that even in those last days of your life, even when you've lost all autonomy and all independence, you are still valued and precious because you are as much made in the image of God as you were in your youth. Next one, another area dignity is denied. It's in injustice. In crime and in wrongdoing, every crime is saying to somebody, saying to the victim, your rights matter less than mine. You are worth less than me. And so punishing crime appropriately, it's another area of recognition of dignity of those who've been wronged, but also recognition of dignity, the value of the criminal, the perpetrator, saying to them, you're made in the image of God. Unlike the animals, you are accountable for your actions. The truth about human dignity impacts justice. And one more, another area that human dignity is denied in our broken world is when it comes to poverty. Sometimes that's because people in poverty are treated as being less valuable. And the book of James warns about this. Suppose a man comes into your meeting wearing a gold ring and fine clothes, and a poor man in filthy old clothes comes in. If you show special attention to the man wearing fine clothes and say, here's a good seat for you, but say to the poor man, oh, you stand over there, have you not discriminated among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? So treating the poor man as less valuable is evil, according to James. So we can deny the dignity of the poor by the way we treat them, but even apart from that, poverty itself is an assault on human dignity. To have someone made in the image of God, reflecting God's glory, majestic by their simple existence, more glorious than the stars, because unlike the stars, this person is made in the image of God. To have that person living in poverty, I think, is one of the outrages of this world. Extreme poverty denies human dignity. So there's just a few ways that the dignity of others is denied. And I know I've covered them really quickly. And actually, take assisted suicide. I spent an entire hour just doing that topic with a church a couple of weeks ago. So you can say far, far more on it. But there are all ways that people can be treated as if they're not made in the image of God, as if they're not priceless and valuable. So back to the UN Declaration of Human Rights. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And Christians have more reason to affirm and celebrate this truth than anyone else. Yet, as we look around, we see the effects that sin and death have had on the world. And we mourn. Because at every stage, at every turn, you just see example after example after example of dignity denied. We have not always acted as those made in the image of God by the way we've behaved, but we've also not treated others as made in the image of God. But that's not the end of the story. It's a depressing note to finish, wouldn't it? No, but the biblical idea of dignity has another stage to the story. So we've been following the dignity narrative through the Bible, starting with dignity given, everything was very good, all of us have value, made in the image of God, and then dignity denied, not lost, not removed, but it's denied in the way we act. But that's not the end of the story either. And so to our third point, dignity restored. So, start off under dignity restored. The first thing that happens is Christ restores our dignity. You see, we're made in the image of God. But Jesus is different. Jesus isn't made in the image of God. You think, hang on, yes he is. No, he's not. Jesus is not made in God's image. Jesus is God's image. The word makes all the difference. He is the image of God. To quote Hebrews 1, he is the exact representation of his being. Colossians 1:15, the Son is the image of the invisible God. And so we're made in God's image. Jesus is God's image. And Jesus' mission, one way to put it, is he came to restore what was broken. He came to remake the image of God in us, which was broken. Because we still reflect God, we still represent him, but not the way we were supposed to. And Jesus came to fix that. He came as one of us, fully human in every way, yet without sin. He died as one of us, taking our sin upon his shoulders. He rose from the dead, the firstborn of the new creation, so we will be also rising from the dead. And then he sends his Spirit to fill us. And what is Christ doing in us now by his Spirit? He is remaking us. Again, if we're like mirrors reflecting God and then smashed mirrors, the pieces shattered into a million tiny pieces across the ground, Jesus is lovingly picking up each piece of the mirror and restoring it to its proper place, mending it, cleaning it, affixing it to the others, using all of life's circumstances, everyone ordained by God, to achieve for us this glorious purpose articulated in Romans 8, when we will be conformed to the image of the Son. So he is making us like him. And this is another glorious truth about the Christian worldview. So that UN Declaration of Human Rights, it tells us we each have dignity. It doesn't give us that dignity, it describes what we already have. And then it uses basically the political influence of being the UN, whatever that is, to try and bring about that dignity across the world. But Christianity is different. It's saying God the Father gives us dignity in the first place by creating us in his image. But then he doesn't just tell us what we are, or what we could be, or what we should be, or what we'll never be, but he offers through Christ, by his Spirit, to remake us into what we long to be. And that's the work of a lifetime, but it will be fully completed when we see him face to face. We know that when Christ appears, we will be like him, for we shall see him as he is. So dignity restored, that's our future, that's our trajectory. Christ is restoring it. But in the meantime, the truths about dignity we've seen shape our present. And so they shape the way, we covered this earlier a little bit, they shape the way we see others. Don't know if you remember back in 2016, the US election campaign, Hillary Clinton described Trump voters as deplorables. She called them irredeemable. Well, to quote her correctly, she said half of Trump voters are deplorable and irredeemable. And she later corrected herself by saying, I don't think it was actually half. And on the other side, Donald Trump called his opponents vermin. And so both sides there are dehumanizing those who are unlike them, using language that's not befitting anyone made in the image of God. Same happens in this country in debates. So, we talked about immigration earlier. There's a variety of legitimate ways for a country to set an immigration policy, but when politicians use dehumanizing language to describe immigrants, that also is wrong, because as Christians we say everyone is made in the image of God. And so we can take the lead in treating everyone with respect and honor, even people we disagree with. Even people with wildly different political views from you. You can say, you are made in the image of God, and I will choose to see you in that light first. Even people with different religions, or those who mock religion altogether, we look at them and say, you're made in the image of God, and I will choose to see you that way first. Even people with different moral codes, different sexualities, those who would say there are different genders, we say, look, We may disagree on this, but I choose to see you first and foremost as someone who's made in the image of God. We can ask God to help us see everyone with that God-given dignity. I love what C.S. Lewis said. You might have heard this quote before. Remember that the dullest, most uninteresting person you can talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship. Or else, a horror and a corruption such as you only now meet in a nightmare. It is in the light of these overwhelming possibilities that we should conduct all our dealings with one another, all friendships, all loves, all play, all politics, because there are no ordinary people. He says, you have never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, these are mortal. Their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. It is immortals who we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit. It's immortals who we interact with every day. People who are dust, yet made in the image of God. So let's ask God to help us see others the right way, but also let's ask God to help us stand up for the rights of those less likely to be valued. At Care, we often come back to Proverbs 31, verses 8 and 9. Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and needy. So who are those who cannot speak for themselves? Whose rights most need to be championed? The more we understand the dignity of every human, everyone made in the image of God, and the more we love our neighbor, the more we will stand up for those who are most vulnerable. We don't all do that in the same way. There's different giftings, different callings. For some, it's going into politics and being activists. For most, it's at a smaller level. It is praying for our nations and leaders. It is writing to our MPs letters full of grace and truth on a wide range of issues. It is giving to charities that do the hard work of standing up for the voiceless. It is then having eyes that are open to see the injustice around us and being ready to speak up when the opportunity arises. It is being ready to open our homes. It is being ready to give of the most precious resource that we have, which is our time, to love those that God places in our path, because everyone is made in the image of God. So that's the Bible story about human dignity, the value and worth of every person made in the image of God. Dignity given, dignity denied, and then in God's goodness, dignity restored. How long have we got? 5 minutes.